Dad, something's wrong. Annie's voice came through the phone, thin and unsteady, as if every word cost her courage. She was whispering, careful, afraid the sound itself might travel beyond the small space where she was hiding. Richard Hale didn't hesitate. He was awake now, fully, the fog of sleep gone in an instant. He sat up on the edge of the hotel bed, spine straight, feet planted on the floor, the way he did when a meeting turned serious. "Annie," he said quietly, firmly, "I'm here. Take a breath for me." There was a soft, shaky inhale on the other end of the line. "That's it," he continued, slowing his own voice on purpose. "You're safe right now. No one can hear you through this phone. I need you to stay calm and tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." She swallowed. "I woke up," Annie said. "I had to go to the bathroom." "Good," Richard said. "Go on." "It was dark," she continued. "I didn't turn on the lights. I was being quiet." "You're doing great," he said, steady and reassuring. "What did you see?" "The door to your room was open," Annie whispered. "Just a little." Richard's jaw tightened, but his tone didn't change. "And who was there?" "Evelyn." The name landed between them, heavy and unmistakable. "All right," Richard said calmly. "Tell me what she was doing." Annie hesitated, then forced the words out, as if afraid they might disappear if she waited too long. "She was at your desk." She had a small black thing in her hand. "She put it into your computer." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. A flash drive. There was no doubt in his mind. "You didn't go into the room?" he asked. "No," Annie said quickly. "I know I'm not allowed. I stayed in the hallway." "That was the right choice," he said. "What happened next?" "She talked on the phone," Annie said. "Very quiet, but she sounded mad. Not like when she talks to me." Richard felt a slow, cold pressure build in his chest, but his voice remained even. "Did she say anything else?" "She said you don't listen to children," Annie whispered. She laughed when she said it. Richard's fingers curled tightly around the phone. "Did she see you?" he asked. "I don't think so," Annie replied. "I went back to my room very slowly. I stayed awake for a long time." "You did exactly what you should have done," he said. "You stayed quiet, and you stayed safe." There was a pause. Then Annie spoke again. "In the morning." Richard didn't interrupt. He knew better. She smiled. Annie said, "She told me sometimes kids dream things when they wake up at night. She said I shouldn't worry you because you have important work." Annie's voice wavered. "She asked me if I wanted you to be mad at me." Richard felt something sharp and unmistakable settle into place. This was no misunderstanding. This was control. "What did you say?" he asked gently. "I said no," Annie whispered. "So she hugged me. And she said good girls don't make trouble." Richard stood and walked toward the window, the city lights far below blurring as his focus narrowed to one thing only. "Annie," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "listen to me very carefully. You did nothing wrong. Do you understand that?" There was silence, then a small voice. "Yes, I believe you," he said without hesitation. Every word. Her breath caught on the other end of the line. "I need to ask you a few more things," he continued. "Are you alone right now?" "Yes," Annie said. "I'm in my room. The door is locked." "Good," Richard said. "Keep it locked. Do not open it for anyone. Not for Evelyn. Not for anyone else. Only me. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, stronger now. "Is your phone hidden?" he asked. "Yes." "Good," he repeated. "If anything changes, if you hear her outside your door, if she says anything to you, you call me immediately, no matter the time." "Okay." Richard glanced at his watch. Midnight was long past. The meeting in the morning no longer existed in his mind. "I'm coming home," he said simply. There was a pause. Then Annie asked, "Right now?" "Yes," he said. "Right now." "Are you angry?" she asked quietly. Richard's reflection stared back at him from the glass, controlled, composed, and very far from calm inside. "I'm not angry at you," he said. "I'm proud of you for telling me." Another shaky breath. "Okay," Annie said. "I want you to lie down," he instructed. "Stay in your room. I'll be there as soon as I can." The call ended. Richard stood still for a moment, the silence of the room pressing in around him. There was no confusion now. No room for doubt or delay. A child had seen something she was never meant to see, and she had been told to question herself for it. That alone was enough. He moved quickly, dressing without thought, canceling calls with a few short messages. As he left the hotel and the night air hit his face, one truth echoed clearly in his mind. When a child whispers the truth, the danger isn't in the words. It's in the adults who choose not to listen. And this time, he was listening. By the time Richard Hale's jet lifted off the private runway, the night had begun to thin at the edges. The sky was still dark, but it no longer felt endless. From the small oval window, he watched the city lights shrink into scattered constellations, then disappear altogether beneath the clouds. He did not sleep. He sat with his jacket folded beside him, hands loosely clasped, posture rigid not from tension but from focus. For years, this was how he prepared before hostile takeovers, before testimony, before decisions that could ruin other men. Calm on the surface, every sense turned inward. But this was different. This was his house, his child. He replayed Annie's words again and again, not searching for holes, not doubting her memory, but mapping the sequence the way he mapped timelines in court. Wake up. Hallway. Door ajar. Evelyn at the desk. A small black device. A phone call. Then the morning conversation. The soft warning wrapped in concern. Good girls don't make trouble. Richard's jaw tightened. He had grown up learning how adults disguised threats as lessons. His father had been a man who believed fear built character. His mother had believed silence kept the peace. Richard had learned early that power rarely raised its voice. It whispered, leaned close, and convinced you that resistance was your own failure. Somewhere below the jet, the country rolled past unseen. He checked his phone again. No missed calls, no messages. Annie had stayed quiet, just as he had told her to. The thought brought him relief and guilt in equal measure. She should not have had to be brave. When the plane began its descent, dawn was just beginning to color the horizon. Pale light spread slowly, indifferent to urgency. Richard watched it without appreciation. There were moments in life when beauty felt almost offensive. The car was waiting when he landed. He didn't speak to the driver beyond a brief nod. The gates of the property appeared sooner than expected, tall and black, opening smoothly at his approach. The house beyond them sat exactly as it always had: clean lines, warm lights, the careful illusion of safety. Nothing looked wrong. That was what made it dangerous. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and citrus cleaner. Early morning quiet pressed in from all sides. Richard set his bag down without a sound and moved through the ground floor slowly, taking in details he had once considered insignificant. A chair slightly out of place. A door not fully closed. The subtle signs of a space used by someone who believed they belonged there unquestioned. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter, her back to him, dressed impeccably in soft gray. She looked exactly as she always did at this hour, composed, domestic, unhurried. When she turned and saw him, her surprise seemed genuine. "Richard," she said, eyes widening, smile forming instantly. "You're home early." "Yes," he replied evenly. Plans changed. She crossed the room to him, reaching up to kiss his cheek. He let her. He noted the light scent of her perfume, the ease of her touch, the way her eyes flicked past him briefly, as if checking something behind his shoulder. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Where's Annie?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Still asleep." "I was going to wake her soon for school." Richard nodded. "I'll get her." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "She can sleep a little longer. She's been restless." "I'll get her," he repeated, still calm. He didn't wait for a response. He took the stairs 2 at a time, every step measured. At the top, he paused outside Annie's door and knocked softly, twice, the signal they had agreed on long ago. "It's me," he said quietly. The lock clicked almost immediately. The door opened just wide enough for Annie to look out. Her eyes were tired, shadows beneath them darker than they should have been on a 6-year-old's face. When she saw him, something in her posture loosened. He crouched down to her level without thinking. "Hey," he said. "You did exactly what I asked." I'm here. She nodded, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. He held her carefully, feeling how light she was, how tightly she clung. It's okay, he murmured. You're safe. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. When he stood, holding her hand, Evelyn was already at the top of the stairs. She watched them with a pleasant expression that did not reach her eyes. I didn't realize you'd be home so early, she said again. Annie, sweetheart. You should have told me you were awake. Annie's fingers tightened around Richard's. She did, Richard said. She told me. The silence that followed was brief but telling. Evelyn's smile returned, slower this time. I'm not sure what you mean. We'll talk later, Richard said. After school. He guided Annie past her. Down the stairs, into the kitchen. He made breakfast himself. Toast, eggs, a glass of orange juice. Ordinary things. Anchors. Annie ate quietly, but she finished every bite. Do you want me to walk you to the car? Evelyn asked, adjusting her jacket. No, Richard said. I will. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room, the recalculation happening behind her eyes. At the door, Annie looked back once. Evelyn smiled and waved. Richard closed the door behind them. The drive to school was silent at first. The streets were waking up slowly, people heading to work, children being hurried along sidewalks by distracted parents. Normal life, the kind that allowed things to hide in plain sight. Dad? Annie said finally. Yes? Is she mad at me? Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. No, he said. She's not mad at you. And even if she were, that wouldn't matter. Adults don't get to scare children into silence. Ever. Annie stared out the window. She said you wouldn't believe me. Richard glanced at her, then back at the road. I believe you. That, more than anything else, seemed to settle something in her. If this moment touched you, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that stand up for truth and quiet courage. When he dropped her off, he watched until she was safely inside the building. Only then did he exhale fully for the first time since the call. As he drove away, his calm hardened into resolve. He had listened. Now he would act, and whatever Evelyn Cross believed she was entitled to, she had underestimated one thing above all else. He was no longer just protecting his interests. He was protecting his daughter. Richard Hale returned to the house alone. The silence inside felt different now, not peaceful, not neutral, but alert, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. He closed the door behind him without a sound and stood still for a moment, letting his senses adjust. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of a clock. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as the house settled. Evelyn was in the living room, seated with perfect posture on the sofa, tablet resting lightly in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her expression warm, composed, rehearsed by years of social instinct. Everything all right at school? She asked. Yes, Richard said. Annie's fine. He took a seat across from her, not beside her. He noticed the detail immediately, the way her shoulders shifted, just a fraction, recalibrating distance. I didn't expect you back until tomorrow, she said. You should have told me you were coming. I wanted to see things as they were, he replied evenly. Evelyn smiled. You make it sound ominous. Do I? He asked. She tilted her head, studying him now. The way she studied people when she thought they were hiding something. You seem tired. I am, Richard said, but not confused. That landed. Evelyn set the tablet aside slowly. What's this about, Richard? He didn't answer immediately. He stood and walked past her toward the hallway, then stopped at the foot of the stairs. I need to check my study. Her voice followed him, light but firm. Now? Yes, I can make coffee, she offered. We can talk after. We're talking now, he said, already moving. Upstairs, the door to his study was closed. It always was. He unlocked it and stepped inside, closing it behind him with deliberate care. The room looked untouched at first glance, books aligned, desk cleared, monitor dark, order preserved. Appearances meant nothing. He turned on the computer. The system booted quickly. He navigated without hesitation, fingers steady, eyes sharp. It took less than a minute to find what he was looking for. An unfamiliar access point, a timestamp from the night before. A device registered that did not belong to him. He stared at the screen, not surprised, not relieved, only resolved. There was a knock at the door. "Richard?" Evelyn's voice, closer now. "Is everything all right?" He closed the laptop and turned. When he opened the door, she stood there, smiling. Concern carefully measured. "You shouldn't worry so much," she said gently. "Stress does things to people. So does manipulation," he replied. The smile faltered, just barely. "What are you implying?" she asked. "I'm not implying," he said. "I'm confirming." They stood facing each other in the hallway, the distance between them no longer intimate but adversarial. Evelyn crossed her arms. An old habit, one she used when conversations turned inconvenient. "Annie told you something," she said. Richard didn't react. "Yes, she's a sensitive child," Evelyn continued smoothly. "She imagines things, especially when she's tired." "She described your actions in detail," Richard said. "Accurately." Evelyn exhaled softly, as if disappointed. "You're choosing to believe a child over me." "I'm choosing to believe the truth," he replied. "And the truth is, you accessed my private files without permission." Her eyes hardened. "I'm your fiancé. You're not my partner in business," he said. Silence stretched between them. Then Evelyn laughed quietly, humorlessly. "You know," she said, "I wondered how long it would take before you noticed." Richard studied her face, seeing it clearly now. Not the charm, not the polish, but the calculation underneath. "You underestimate me," she went on. "You built everything you have by being ruthless. I simply did what needed to be done more efficiently." "And scaring a child was part of that?" he asked. "She wasn't scared," Evelyn said sharply. "She was curious. And curiosity is dangerous in children who don't know their place." Richard felt something cold settle into his chest. "My daughter's place," he said slowly, "is safety." Evelyn shook her head. "You made her a symbol, a gesture. You didn't think through the consequences." "Get out," Richard said. Her eyes widened slightly. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said. "Pack your things. Leave the house." "And what will you tell people?" she asked. "That your perfect future fell apart because of a bedtime story?" "I'll tell them the truth," he said. "Or nothing at all." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, then straightened. "You're making a mistake." "No," Richard said. "I already made one. This is me correcting it." She turned without another word and walked toward the bedroom. Richard listened as drawers opened, suitcases dragged free. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. When the front door finally closed behind her, the house exhaled. Richard remained where he was for a long time, the weight of what had almost happened settling slowly. He thought of Annie in her classroom, learning letters, trusting that the world made sense because the adults around her told her it did. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message to his security team, then another to his legal counsel. Then he went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, waiting. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he stood to lose. He was thinking about what he had nearly failed to protect, and he knew this was only the beginning. Annie sensed the change before anyone told her. It wasn't something she could name or explain. It was in the way the house felt when she came home from school that afternoon, quieter, but not the quiet that made her nervous. This quiet felt like when a storm had passed and the air hadn't decided what to do next. Richard was waiting at the gate himself. Not the driver, not security, him. Annie spotted him through the car window and her shoulders relaxed without her realizing it. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, posture straight, eyes fixed only on the car. When the door opened, she climbed out and walked straight to him. He knelt immediately, meeting her at eye level. "Hey," he said softly. She searched his face, the way children do when they're checking for danger. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Richard said at once. "You're not. You did exactly what you were supposed to do." He said it slowly, clearly, as if he needed her to hear every word and keep it somewhere safe. "Did I do something bad?" she asked. "No," he repeated. "You did something brave." The word felt strange in Annie's ears. Brave was for people in books, knights, heroes. not kids who whispered into phones from closets. "Oh," she said. He stood and took her hand as they walked inside. The front door closed behind them, and Annie noticed something immediately. Evelyn's shoes were gone. She stopped walking. "Where is she?" Richard didn't answer right away. He guided her into the living room and sat with her on the couch. Not too close, not too far. He thought carefully before speaking, the way he did when explaining things that mattered. "She doesn't live here anymore," he said. Annie's heart skipped. "Because of me?" "No," he said firmly. "Because of her choices." She stared at her hands. "She said I made things difficult." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Annie, listen to me. When adults do something wrong, it's not a child's job to make it easier for them. It's their job to stop." She absorbed that in silence. "Are you mad at her?" Annie asked. "I'm disappointed," Richard said. "And I'm angry about what she did, but I'm glad you told me." Annie nodded slowly, as if storing the information away for later, when she might need it again. They stayed there for a while, the afternoon light stretching across the floor. Richard let her talk about school, about a drawing she'd made, about a boy who sat too close during reading time. Ordinary things. He listened to every word. Later, when Annie went upstairs to change, Richard remained in the living room, his phone vibrating quietly beside him. Messages from lawyers, security updates, timelines forming, consequences unfolding. He read them all. He responded to none. Instead, he stood and walked through the house again, slower this time, not searching for threats, but for understanding. He noticed how easily access had been granted, how many decisions he had delegated without question, how often he had mistaken presence for protection. In his study, he opened the laptop again. This time, he went deeper. The access logs told a story that was methodical, patient, and arrogant. Files reviewed, but not altered. Copies made quietly. Financial data, legal strategies, the kind of information that could be used to influence him without his knowledge. Evelyn hadn't been careless. She had been confident. Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of it settling over him. He thought of the way she had spoken to Annie, the calm certainty, the assumption that a child's word would never matter enough to disrupt her plans. She had been right about one thing. Most of the time, it wouldn't have. That evening, Annie ate dinner with him at the kitchen table. No formal setting, no staff hovering. Just pasta, bread, and a glass of milk she spilled slightly when she reached too fast. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, eyes wide. Richard handed her a napkin. "It's okay," he said. "Spills happen." She wiped it carefully. Evelyn didn't like spills. Richard didn't respond to that. He filed it away with all the other small things that now felt much bigger. After dinner, he walked Annie upstairs himself. He checked the locks. He checked the windows, not because he thought danger waited outside, but because he wanted her to see him do it. "Will you read tonight?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said. He sat beside her bed and read until her breathing slowed and evened out. When he finished, he closed the book but didn't get up right away. "Dad," Annie murmured, half asleep. "Yes? Next time something feels wrong. Can I tell you again?" Richard swallowed. "Always." She nodded and turned onto her side, comforted by the certainty in his voice. When he left her room, Richard stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the quiet of the house. It no longer felt watchful. It felt wounded, but healing. Downstairs, his phone buzzed again. A message from his attorney, short and precise. There would be consequences. Public ones, private ones. Evelyn Cross would not disappear quietly. Richard stared at the screen, then turned it face down on the counter. Whatever came next, he would face it differently than before, because now he knew something he had forgotten. Power did not protect children. Attention did. The first call came just after midnight. Richard was sitting alone in the study, the lights dimmed, the house wrapped in a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. Annie was asleep upstairs. He had checked twice. Old habits, he told himself, though he knew better. Some habits were born from fear, others from responsibility. The phone vibrated softly against the desk. Unknown number. He didn't answer it right away. He watched the screen light up, go dark, then light up again. Persistence was a language he understood well. When he finally picked up, he didn't speak first. "Richard," Evelyn's voice said, smooth and familiar, stripped of the pleasant warmth she used in public. "You're overreacting." He closed his eyes briefly. "This conversation isn't happening." "Of course it is," she replied. "You just don't like how it makes you feel." He hung up. The phone vibrated again almost immediately. This time, he turned it face down. Richard stood and walked to the window. The property stretched out below, dark and quiet. Trees lining the drive like silent witnesses. He had spent years building defenses against hostile competitors, against lawsuits, against governments that wanted their share. He had not prepared for this kind of intrusion, the kind that wore familiarity like armor. Behind him, the laptop screen glowed faintly. He returned to the desk and opened a new file, one he rarely needed. A full forensic review, access points, external transfers, patterns. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger clouded judgment. He was methodical. By morning, he had confirmation of what he already knew. The copied files weren't random. They were targeted. Legal vulnerabilities, pending acquisitions, documents that, in the wrong hands, could pressure him into decisions he would never knowingly make. Evelyn hadn't planned to destroy him. She had planned to steer him. At breakfast, Annie sat across from him, swinging her legs slightly under the table. She was quieter than usual, watching him with careful eyes. "Did I do something bad again?" she asked suddenly. Richard looked up from his coffee. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged. "You look serious." He set the mug down. "I'm thinking." "That's all." Annie nodded, then hesitated. She used to say, "Thinking too much makes people angry." Richard considered that. "Sometimes thinking makes people uncomfortable," he said. "That doesn't mean it's wrong." She seemed satisfied with that and returned to her cereal. Later that morning, he drove her to school again. He noticed how she stayed close to him when they walked through the doors, how her grip tightened briefly before she let go. "I'll be here," he said. Same time, she nodded and disappeared into the classroom. As he turned away, he caught a few curious looks from other parents. Whispers moved fast in their circles. Evelyn Cross leaving suddenly was not something people would ignore. He welcomed it. Back at the house, his legal counsel arrived, followed by his head of security. The meeting was short, efficient. Options were laid out. Civil action, criminal investigation, damage control. "She'll claim misunderstanding," his attorney said. "She'll say she was acting in your best interest." "She wasn't," Richard replied. The attorney nodded. "We can prove intent." "Do it," Richard said, quietly. When they left, the house felt emptier, but lighter. Richard walked through the rooms again, noticing details that had once blended into the background. A photograph missing from the hallway, a drawer left open in the guest room. Signs of departure. That afternoon, Annie came home with a drawing. She held it up proudly. "This is us," she said. The picture showed 3 figures, one tall, one small, one medium-sized with a big X drawn through it. Richard crouched beside her. "Who's that?" "You," she said, pointing to the tall one. "Me. And that's the person who doesn't live here anymore." He nodded. "That's right." She studied his face. "Is she gone forever?" "She won't be coming back here," he said. "Okay," Annie said, then added, "I like it better now." That night, Richard received another call. This time, it wasn't Evelyn. "Mr. Hale," a man said calmly. "This is Detective Morris. We need to speak with you regarding Evelyn Cross." Richard listened without interruption. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll cooperate fully." After the call ended, he sat at the kitchen table long after the lights had been turned off. He thought about how close he had come to dismissing Annie's fear, how easily he could have convinced himself that children exaggerated, that adults knew better. He thought about how often society believed that lie. Upstairs, Annie shifted in her sleep. He heard the faint sound through the monitor he had insisted on keeping, despite being told she was too old for it. He went to her room and stood in the doorway, watching her breathe, the steady rhythm of safety slowly returning. "You were right," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "And I should have listened sooner." As he turned away, his phone buzzed once more. A final message from an unknown number. "You're making a powerful enemy." Richard deleted it without responding. Power, he knew now, was not measured by who feared you. It was measured by who you protected when it mattered most. The news broke quietly at first. A short item in the business section. No headline, no photographs. Just a carefully worded paragraph noting that an internal investigation had been opened regarding unauthorized access to proprietary information at Hale Industries. Names were not mentioned. Motives were not speculated on. It was the kind of story most people skimmed and forgot before reaching the bottom of the page. Richard read it once, then folded the paper and set it aside. He knew better than to mistake silence for safety. That morning, Annie moved through the house with a new kind of caution. Not fear, Richard would have recognized that immediately, but awareness. She stayed closer to him as they ate breakfast. When he stood, she stood. When he paused, she looked up at his face, waiting for a signal she didn't yet know how to name. "You don't have school today," he told her gently. Her eyebrows drew together. "Am I sick?" "No," he said. "It's a day off, just for us." She considered this carefully, then nodded. "Okay." They spent the morning doing things that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. He helped her with a puzzle on the living room floor. They watered the plants together in the sunroom. When she spilled water on the tiles, she froze for a split second, eyes darting toward him. "It's all right," he said immediately, handing her a towel. "Nothing bad happens because of a mistake." She watched him wipe the floor, absorbing the words not as reassurance, but as a new rule of the world. Late morning, Richard's phone buzzed. This time, he answered. "Mr. Hale," Detective Morris said. "We have reason to believe Miss Cross attempted to transfer a partial data set to an external account late last night. Was she successful?" Richard asked. "No," Morris replied. The transfer was interrupted. Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Good. There's something else." The detective continued. "She contacted a third party shortly after leaving your residence. Someone with prior involvement in corporate coercion cases." Richard felt the edges of the day sharpen. "Not yet. But this may go beyond personal betrayal. We're advising caution." Richard glanced at Annie, who was kneeling on the floor nearby, carefully lining up puzzle pieces. "Understood," he said. "Keep me informed." When the call ended, he stayed still for a moment, weighing what to say and what to hold back. Annie looked up at him, sensing the shift. "Is something wrong again?" she asked. He knelt beside her. "Something complicated," he said. "But it's being handled." She nodded, then hesitated. "Are there more bad secrets?" Richard considered the question. "There are secrets in the world," he said. "But they don't get to live in this house." She seemed to accept that. That afternoon, his security team arrived without uniforms, without vehicles that drew attention. They moved quietly, methodically, checking systems, reinforcing protocols. Richard watched from the doorway, not interfering, but not distant either. He wanted Annie to see that safety was not invisible. It was built. One of the guards spoke to him in low tones. "We recommend limited movement for a few days." Richard nodded. "She stays with me." "Understood." When evening came, Annie sat on the steps outside, watching the sky turn orange and then deep blue. Richard joined her, handing her a glass of juice. "Dad?" she said. "Yes?" "Evelyn said people like us have to be careful because everyone wants what we have." Richard followed her gaze to the horizon. "Some people want things that aren't theirs," he said. "That's true. But that doesn't mean we live afraid." She kicked her feet gently against the step. She said being quiet keeps people safe. Richard looked at her then. Really looked. "Being honest keeps people safe," he said. "Being quiet only helps the wrong person." Annie nodded slowly, as if turning the idea over in her mind. That night, after she was asleep, Richard sat in the study again. The laptop was open, but he wasn't reading documents. He was looking at a photograph on the corner of the desk, Annie on her first day of school, smiling uncertainly, trusting him to be where she needed him to be. His phone vibrated. A message, no sender ID. "You exposed her too soon." Richard typed back a single word. "No." The response came almost immediately. "This doesn't end quietly." Richard didn't reply. He powered down the laptop and turned off the light, leaving the room dark and still. Quiet, he knew now, was not peace. Peace came from choosing the right noise at the right moment. Upstairs, Annie stirred in her sleep. He went to her room and stood by the door, listening to her breathing. Slow, even, safe. For now. You spoke up, he murmured softly. A promise meant more for himself than for her. I won't waste that. As he turned away, Richard accepted what had been forming since the first midnight call. Evelyn Cross had not been acting alone, and whoever had taught her to threaten with a smile would not stop simply because she was gone. The first sign that the situation was no longer contained came on a Tuesday morning. Richard noticed it not through alarms or messages, but through absence. Annie didn't finish her breakfast. She pushed the bowl away after a few spoonfuls and sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes drifting toward the hallway, then back to him. She wasn't afraid. She was listening. Are you feeling sick? Richard asked. She shook her head. No. Something on your mind? Annie hesitated, then nodded. I heard voices last night. Richard set his coffee down slowly.
Where did you hear them, sweetie?
Where? Outside, she said. Not in the house. By the gate. His body went still, though his face didn't change. What kind of voices? Men, Annie replied. They were talking quietly, like they didn't want anyone to hear. Did you hear what they said? She frowned, trying to remember. One of them said your name. Richard reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you for telling me, he said. You did the right thing. Her shoulders eased just a little. After he walked her to school and watched her disappear inside, Richard didn't leave right away. He stayed in the car, eyes scanning the street, the parked vehicles, the ordinary rhythm of parents and children moving through their mornings. Nothing stood out. That, too, stood out. Back at the house, he called his head of security. I want full perimeter review, he said. Footage from last night. All angles. Already on it, the man replied. We saw movement near the outer fence around 2:10 a.m. No breach. Not yet, Richard said. By noon, the footage was on his screen. Two figures, faces obscured by darkness and distance, standing just beyond the property line, close enough to watch, far enough to avoid trespass. They stayed for 11 minutes. They didn't try to enter. They didn't need to. That afternoon, Richard received a call from his attorney. She's retained counsel, the attorney said. Aggressive. Expected, Richard replied. There's more, the attorney continued. They're floating a narrative. That Miss Cross was acting under pressure. That she feared for her safety. That your household environment was unstable. Richard smiled without humor. Because a child spoke up. Exactly, the attorney said. They'll imply she was manipulated. By me, Richard finished. Yes. When the call ended, Richard stood at the window again, watching the grounds. He felt no panic, only clarity. This was how it worked. Undermine the child, undermine the parent, shift focus, blur responsibility. That evening, Annie was quiet again, but not withdrawn. She sat at the table drawing, her crayons lined up neatly by color. What are you making? Richard asked. She held up the page. It showed a house, drawn solid and square, with thick lines. Around it, she had drawn small shapes, stick figures, some with faces, some without. These are people who look, she said. Look at what? He asked. Our house, Annie replied. They don't come inside. Richard studied the drawing. How does that make you feel? She shrugged. I don't like being looked at. I don't either, he said. After dinner, as he tucked her into bed, Annie asked a question she'd been holding all day. Dad? Yes? Did I make her angry? Richard paused. He chose his words carefully. You didn't make her angry, he said. You made her exposed. Annie blinked. Is that bad? For her, he said. Not for you. She thought about that, then nodded. Later that night, the phone rang again. This time, the number was blocked. Mr. Hale, a man's voice said, calm and unhurried. We should talk. Richard didn't ask who it was. About what? About Evelyn Cross, the man said. And about Annie, Richard felt the air in the room shift. "You don't get to say my daughter's name," he replied, a soft chuckle. "You're emotional. That's understandable. But emotions make people careless. And threats make people visible," Richard said. "Who are you?" There was a pause. Then, "Someone who fixes problems before they become public." "You're too late," Richard said. "On the contrary," the man replied. "This is when it becomes interesting." The line went dead. Richard stood there for a long moment, phone still in his hand. He didn't need to guess what this was. He had seen versions of it before, in boardrooms and courtrooms, wrapped in suits instead of shadows. Pressure, leverage, a test. He walked upstairs and checked on Annie. She was asleep, curled on her side, her breathing slow and even. He watched her for a full minute, committing the image to memory. Then he went back downstairs and made 3 calls. One to his legal team, one to federal investigators, and one to a person he hadn't spoken to in years. "I need you," he said when the call connected. There was a pause, then a familiar voice. "I was wondering when you'd stop pretending this was just business." "It's not," Richard said. "It's family." The voice on the other end grew serious. "Then we do this properly." When the call ended, Richard sat alone in the darkened study, the house quiet around him. Evelyn Cross had been a door. What waited behind it was much larger, and this time, he wouldn't allow anyone to whisper his child into silence again. The man Richard called arrived just before sunrise. There were no announcements, no security escorts walking him through the house. He came the way people who understood discretion always did, quietly, efficiently, without leaving a trace of importance behind him. Thomas Reed looked older than Richard remembered. The years had settled into his face, not as weakness, but as refinement. His hair had gone fully gray, his movements slower but deliberate. He wore a plain coat, no tie, no badge, no visible authority. But when he spoke, the room seemed to listen. "You still live like a man who expects trouble," Thomas said, scanning the house with an appraising eye. "And you still show up when it matters," Richard replied. They sat at the kitchen table with untouched coffee between them. Outside, the morning light crept across the lawn, soft and deceptive. "Start from the beginning," Thomas said. Richard did. He told him about Annie's call, about Evelyn, about the files, the men at the gate, the voice on the phone that had said Annie's name as if it were a bargaining chip. Thomas listened without interrupting, hands folded, eyes steady. When Richard finished, there was a long silence. "This isn't just corporate coercion," Thomas said finally. "It's grooming." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's what I thought. They test boundaries," Thomas continued. "They look for houses where children are taught to stay quiet, where adults are busy, distracted, convinced that danger always comes from outside." Richard exhaled slowly. "I won't let them near her." "You already did," Thomas said gently. "Once. That's enough for them to try again." Richard stood and paced the room. "Then tell me how this ends." Thomas looked at him carefully. "It doesn't end quickly, and it doesn't end clean, but it ends with light. That's the only thing these people can't survive." Upstairs, a soft footstep sounded on the stairs. Annie appeared at the edge of the room, still in her pajamas, rubbing one eye. She froze when she saw Thomas. Richard turned instantly. "Hey," he said. "You're up early." She nodded, then looked at Thomas. "Who's he?" Thomas didn't move. He waited. "This is an old friend," Richard said. "Someone who helps keep people safe." Annie studied Thomas for a long moment, then asked the question she always asked when she needed to understand something important. "Are you a good person?" Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "I try to be," he said honestly. She seemed to accept that. She walked to Richard's side and took his hand. Thomas watched the exchange carefully. "She's observant," he said quietly. "She had to be," Richard replied. They didn't talk about it further. That morning, Thomas walked the perimeter with the security team. He asked questions no one else had thought to ask, not just where the cameras were, but why they were placed that way. Not just who had access, but who had been trusted without question. By midday, a clearer picture had formed. "This wasn't Evelyn's operation," Thomas said as they reviewed notes. "She was a node, A facilitator. And the men at the gate? Richard asked. Scouts, Thomas replied. Pressure without escalation. They wanted to see how fast you reacted. Richard's mouth tightened. They used Annie to measure me. Yes, Thomas said. And you failed their expectations. Richard looked up. How so? They expected denial. Delay. Rationalization, Thomas said. Instead, you acted immediately. You removed Evelyn. You involved law enforcement. You changed patterns. Richard nodded slowly. That makes you unpredictable, Thomas continued. And that makes you dangerous to them. That afternoon, Annie stayed close to Richard as he worked from home. She colored quietly at the desk while he reviewed documents, her presence grounding him more than she could ever know. At one point, she looked up. Dad? Yes. If bad people don't like light, she said carefully, why don't we just turn on all the lights? Richard smiled despite himself. That's exactly what we're doing. That night, the house didn't sleep, not from fear, but from readiness. Cameras were adjusted, protocols rewritten, names added to lists that hadn't existed before. Thomas made calls from the study, speaking in low tones to people whose voices carried authority without recognition. Near midnight, Richard's phone rang again. Same blocked number. He answered this time. You're escalating, the voice said. Calm. Controlled. Annoyed. No, Richard replied. I'm responding. You're putting a child at the center of a very adult conflict, the man said. You did that, Richard shot back. The moment you said her name, silence stretched. You think exposure protects you, the man said. It doesn't. It makes you a target. Richard's voice was ice. Then aim carefully. The line went dead. Richard didn't move for a long time. Then he went upstairs and checked on Annie. She was asleep, one arm wrapped around a stuffed animal, the other curled beneath her pillow. He sat beside her bed and allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the weight of what could have happened, what almost had. I'm here, he whispered, and I'm not going anywhere. Downstairs, Thomas watched the security feeds alone. This is only the beginning, he murmured to himself. But for the first time since Evelyn had entered Richard Hale's life, the beginning belonged to the right people. The first leak appeared online before noon. It wasn't dramatic. No headlines, no accusations. Just a thread on a financial forum frequented by people who like to feel smarter than the markets they failed to predict. An anonymous post, a question framed as speculation. Has anyone noticed Hale Industries quietly pulling out of the Westbridge acquisition? Looks like internal instability. Possible leadership issue? Richard read it once, then handed the tablet to Thomas. That's the opening move, Thomas said. Not an attack, a probe. They're testing how fast it spreads, Richard replied. And who repeats it, Thomas added. By mid-afternoon, a business blog had picked it up. By evening, a cable news panel mentioned it in passing between segments on interest rates and foreign markets. Still nothing concrete, just uncertainty. Uncertainty was leverage. At home, Annie was doing homework at the dining table. She frowned at a math problem, erased it, then erased it again. I don't like numbers, she said quietly. Richard looked up from his laptop. Why not? They change, she replied. You think you know the answer, but then it's wrong. Richard considered that. Some numbers change, he said. Some don't. The trick is knowing which ones matter. She nodded, not fully convinced, but reassured enough to keep working. Thomas watched them from the doorway. She hears more than you think. I know, Richard said. That's why I don't lie to her. Good, Thomas replied. Because they will. That night, the second move came. A call from a board member. Friendly, concerned, carefully vague. We're just wondering if everything is stable on your end, the man said. There's chatter. There's always chatter, Richard replied. Yes, but this feels coordinated. Richard smiled faintly. It is. The silence on the other end told him enough. After the call, Richard stood in the kitchen, staring at the darkened backyard. Thomas joined him. Arms crossed. They're not coming for your money, Thomas said. They're coming for your credibility. And using Annie as the pressure point, Richard replied. They'll never mention her directly, Thomas said. That would cross a line too publicly. But they'll imply distraction, question judgment, suggest emotional compromise. Richard's voice was flat. Because I'm a single father. Yes, Thomas said. And because she's not biologically yours. The words landed with controlled precision. Richard didn't flinch. Say it. They'll suggest instability in the home, Thomas continued. They'll say you're vulnerable to manipulation because you rescued a child and built your life around her. Richard turned to face him. She's not a weakness. I know, Thomas said. But they don't need truth. They need a story that sounds plausible to people who already want an excuse. Upstairs, Annie laughed at something on her tablet. The sound cut through the tension like light through fog. Richard exhaled slowly. Then we don't play defense. Thomas raised an eyebrow. No, we go first, Richard said. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He told the truth publicly. Not all of it. Not the parts that would endanger Annie, but enough. He released a statement. Calm. Precise. Acknowledging an internal security breach. Confirming cooperation with federal authorities. Reaffirming leadership and transparency. And then, at the end, a single sentence that made Thomas nod in approval. As a father, I take personal responsibility for ensuring my home and my company are governed by the same principle. Trust must be earned, and silence is never acceptable when something feels wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating. The forums erupted. The tone shifted. Speculation turned to questions. Questions turned to scrutiny of Evelyn Cross, of her access, of her sudden disappearance. By afternoon, the narrative had changed. Annie noticed anyway. You talked about us on TV, she said that evening, sitting cross-legged on the couch. About something important, Richard replied. About listening, she said. Yes, she thought for a moment. That means you didn't ignore me. No, he said. I didn't. She smiled, small but certain. That night, the gate cameras picked up movement again. One figure this time. Closer than before. Thomas and the security team watched the feed in silence as the man stopped just outside the property line. He didn't hide. He looked directly at the camera and raised his phone. Taking a picture. A message arrived seconds later on Richard's phone. You're forcing our hand, Richard typed back. Good. He deleted the thread and powered off the phone. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, unaware of how many adults were now circling a truth spoken by a child. Richard stood at her door for a long moment before turning away. They had wanted quiet compliance. They had awakened something else entirely. The knock came at 6:12 a.m. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to announce intention. Richard was already awake. He crossed the foyer without haste, signaling to security with a glance before opening the door himself. 2 federal agents stood on the step, credentials visible, posture respectful but immovable. Behind them, a dark sedan idled at the curb. Mr. Hale, the taller one said. I'm Agent Collins. This is Agent Rivera. We need to speak with you about an escalating situation involving Evelyn Cross and several associated parties. Richard nodded. Come in. They moved into the living room, eyes scanning out of habit rather than suspicion. Thomas appeared from the hallway, coffee in hand, already aware of what this meant. We've intercepted communications suggesting an attempt to coerce you into reversing your public position, Collins said. Financial pressure, reputation management, the usual methods. And Annie? Richard asked directly. Rivera met his gaze. Indirect references only, but yes, she's part of the leverage calculus. Richard's expression didn't change. Then we're done talking hypotheticals. That's why we're here, Collins said. We'd like to offer protective custody options. No, Richard replied immediately. Thomas raised a hand slightly. Let him finish. We're not suggesting relocation, Collins clarified. We're suggesting coordination. You stay where you are. We control the variables you can't see. Richard considered that. And what do you need from me? Access, Rivera said, to everything Evelyn touched, and a willingness to let this play out publicly if necessary. Richard exhaled slowly. She won't stop. No, Collins agreed. Neither will the people behind her. Upstairs, a door creaked. Annie stood at the top of the stairs, hair still rumpled from sleep, her small hand gripping the railing. She looked down at the unfamiliar men, then at Richard. "Are they police?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said gently. "They're here to help." She thought about that, then nodded once, accepting the answer without fear. "Okay." She went back to her room without another word. Rivera watched her disappear. "She's composed. She had to grow up fast," Richard said quietly. "That ends now." The agents spent the next 2 hours reviewing systems, documents, timelines. Thomas filled in gaps. Richard answered questions precisely, without embellishment. At 9:30, Annie came downstairs dressed for school. Richard knelt to straighten her jacket. "There will be people around today," he told her. "That doesn't mean something bad is happening." She studied his face. "It means you're being careful." "Yes," he said. "Very careful." She nodded, satisfied. The drive to school felt longer than usual. Richard noticed every car that lingered too long, every pedestrian who turned their head. He parked, walked Annie to the door, and waited until she was inside before returning to the car. His phone buzzed as soon as he sat down. A video. He didn't open it immediately. He drove away first, pulled over 3 blocks down, then pressed play. Evelyn appeared on the screen, seated in what looked like a tasteful office, hair perfect, eyes carefully tired. "I never wanted this to be public," she said softly. "But I can't stay silent while my character is destroyed." Richard watched without blinking. "I cared deeply for Richard," Evelyn continued, "and for Annie. But the environment became unpredictable. I feared for my safety, and for hers." Richard closed the video before it finished. That's the narrative," Thomas said when he returned home and relayed it. "Victimhood, concern, implied instability, using a child as moral cover," Richard replied. "Exactly." Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Carefully edited, sympathetic commentary. The words unstable and emotional began appearing with uncomfortable frequency. Richard said nothing. That evening, Annie asked the question he'd been waiting for. "Why is she on the TV?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on the rug. "She's telling her version of the story," Richard said. "Is it true?" "No," he said simply. "Then why do people listen?" Richard thought for a moment. "Because it's easier than asking harder questions." She frowned. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." After Annie went to bed, Richard sat with Thomas in the darkened study. "They're pushing towards something," Thomas said. "A public confrontation, or a private ultimatum. And if I don't bend, they escalate." Richard nodded. "Then we make sure the escalation backfires." At 11:47 p.m., the message arrived. "Final offer. Walk away quietly. Custody arrangements can be discussed." Richard stared at the screen, his hand steady. He typed a response. "Any future attempt to reference my daughter will be treated as a criminal act." He sent it. Then he forwarded the message to the agents. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, unaware that a line had just been drawn that could not be erased. Richard stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the quiet. They had tried fear. They had tried shame. Now they would try force, and he was ready. The escalation came disguised as procedure. Richard learned this just after noon, when his attorney called with a tone that was careful enough to be alarming. "There's been a filing," she said. "Emergency petition. Family court." Richard closed his eyes slowly. "On what grounds?" "Concern for the child's emotional welfare," she replied. "They're requesting a temporary review of guardianship." For a brief moment, the room seemed to tilt not from panic, but from the sheer audacity of it. "She has no standing," Richard said. "Not legally," the attorney agreed. "But filings like this aren't about winning. They're about creating doubt." Richard said nothing. He was already thinking several steps ahead. By the time Annie came home from school, the house was no longer simply guarded. It was observed. Unmarked vehicles sat at respectful distances. Phones rang quietly in other rooms. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Annie noticed anyway. "Why are there so many cars?" she asked as Richard helped her hang up her coat. "Because some people don't know when to stop," he said. "And other people are here to make sure they do." She considered that, then nodded. "Okay, but later, As she colored at the table, she spoke again. "Dad? Yes? If people say mean things about you," she said carefully, "does that make them true?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "No," he said, "but it can make them loud." She frowned. "I don't like loud lies." "Neither do I," he thought. That evening, Thomas briefed him in the study. "They're setting up a narrative where intervention looks reasonable," Thomas said. "Not dramatic. Concerned. Precautionary. Using the system as a weapon," Richard replied. "Yes," Thomas said, "and the system doesn't like being accused of that." Richard stared at the wall for a long moment. "Then we don't accuse it. We educate it." At 9 p.m., the agents returned. "We expected this move," Agent Collins said. "They won't get custody, but they can force interviews, evaluations, delays." "And Annie?" Richard asked. "She won't be removed," Collins said firmly, "but she may be spoken to." Richard's jaw tightened. "Only with me present. That can be arranged." Upstairs, Annie was brushing her teeth, humming softly to herself. Richard watched from the doorway, the normalcy of the moment grounding him. "Dad," she said around the toothbrush, "are you in trouble?" He knelt beside her. "No," he said. "I'm in a disagreement." "With who?" "With people who don't like being told no." She spat into the sink and wiped her mouth. "You tell me no sometimes." "Yes," he said. "And how do you feel about that?" She shrugged. "I don't like it, but I know why you do it." He smiled faintly. "That's the difference." Later, after she was asleep, Richard opened a locked drawer in the study. Inside were documents he rarely touched. Old ones. Adoption records. Psychological evaluations. Letters from teachers. Doctors. Social workers. A life documented not as an asset, but as a child. He organized them carefully, not for defense, but for clarity. At 2:17 a.m., his phone buzzed again. A new message. Unknown number. "You're putting her through unnecessary stress. End this, and it goes away." Richard stared at the words, feeling no temptation, no hesitation. He typed back, "You are the stress, and you will not be near her again." This time, the reply didn't come. The next morning, the interview request arrived officially. Neutral language. Soft deadlines. The appearance of fairness. Richard read it, then folded the letter and placed it on the table. "Okay," he said quietly. Thomas looked up. "Okay? We cooperate," Richard said. "Fully, transparently, on our terms." That afternoon, Annie sat with him in the garden, pulling weeds from the soil with small, determined hands. "Why do people try to take things that aren't theirs?" she asked suddenly. Richard thought of Evelyn, of the men at the gate, of systems bent just enough to harm. "Sometimes," he said, "because they think no one will stop them." She nodded. "You stop them." "I try," he said. She smiled, dirt smudged on her cheek. "I like that." As the sun dipped low, Richard felt the weight of what lay ahead settle fully into place. This was no longer just about exposure or leverage. It was about precedent, about whether a child's quiet courage could be twisted into a liability, about whether truth, once spoken, could be made to disappear through paperwork and polite concern. He looked at Annie, kneeling in the grass, completely unaware of how many adults were arguing over the shape of her life. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not allow the system to become another whisper telling her to be quiet. Not now. Not ever. The interview was scheduled for Thursday morning. Not at the house. Not at a courthouse. A neutral office in a low-rise building with beige walls and carefully chosen furniture, meant to feel comforting without offering warmth. The kind of place where difficult conversations were softened by neutral colors and polite smiles. Richard arrived early. Annie sat beside him, feet not quite touching the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a blue sweater she liked because it felt quiet, her word for things that didn't draw attention. "You remember what we talked about?" Richard asked gently. She nodded. "I just tell the truth." "That's right," he said. "And if you don't know an answer, I can say I don't know." "Yes," he said. "That's an honest answer, too." The door opened, and a woman stepped in. Mid-40s, professional but not cold. She introduced herself as Miss Keller, her voice calm, practiced, not unkind. "Good morning, Annie," she said, crouching slightly to be closer to eye level. "I'm going to ask you a few questions today. There are no right or wrong answers." Annie looked at Richard. He nodded once. "I know," Annie said softly. "Just the truth." Miss Keller smiled faintly and gestured toward the inner room. "Whenever you're ready." Richard stayed where he was. That had been negotiated carefully. Annie walked in without hesitation, her small step steady. Richard watched the door close behind her, then forced himself to sit back, to wait, to trust the very thing he had taught her. Time stretched. 10 minutes. Then 20. Richard focused on his breathing, on the weight of his feet against the floor. He reminded himself that this was not a trial, that Annie was not alone, that silence here was procedural, not punitive. Still, every instinct in him strained against the waiting. Inside the room, Annie sat with her hands folded, answering questions the way she had been taught, but also the way she felt. "She used to tell me not to wake my dad," Annie said when asked about Evelyn. "Even when I was scared." Miss Keller's pen paused briefly. "She said good girls don't make trouble," Annie continued, "and that dads don't like kids who lie." "Did your dad ever say that?" Miss Keller asked. Annie shook her head. "He says I can always tell him. And when you did, he came home right away." The pen paused again. "Did anyone tell you what to say today?" Miss Keller asked gently. Annie frowned, thinking carefully. "No. Dad said I should say what really happened, even if it's quiet." Miss Keller nodded slowly. When Annie returned to the waiting room, Richard stood immediately. Annie walked straight to him and slipped her hand into his. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "You did perfectly," he said, his voice steady, though his chest felt tight. Miss Keller followed them out a few minutes later. "Mr. Hale," she said, professional but direct. "Thank you for your cooperation." Richard met her eyes. "And? There is no basis for further action regarding guardianship," she said. "The petition will be dismissed." Annie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. They got into the car, and Annie buckled herself in, then looked up at Richard with quiet seriousness. "Am I in trouble anymore?" she asked. "No," Richard said. "You're safe." She nodded, satisfied. That afternoon, the response came swiftly. Evelyn's legal team withdrew the petition without comment. The business blogs shifted tone again, this time more cautious. Words like overreach and miscalculation began to appear. Thomas called just before dinner. "They misjudged the optics," he said. "A calm child telling the truth doesn't fit their narrative." "Good," Richard replied, but he didn't relax. That evening, as Annie worked on a puzzle in the living room, Richard sat nearby, reviewing a report Thomas had sent over. Names, connections, financial trails that didn't belong to Evelyn, but passed through her. She hadn't been the architect. She had been the doorway. "Dad?" Annie said suddenly. "Yes? Why do grown-ups lie if it makes things worse?" Richard set the paper aside. "Sometimes they think lying gives them control." She placed a puzzle piece carefully. "It didn't work." "No," he agreed. "It didn't." That night, after Annie was asleep, Richard stood by the window again. The property was quiet. No figures by the gate. No cars lingering too long, but quiet no longer fooled him. His phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a message from Agent Collins. "We're moving forward. Charges, likely. You did the right thing, holding the line." Richard read it once, then looked upstairs. Annie had spoken softly, and the world had shifted. He understood now what his enemies had never accounted for. Truth didn't need volume. It needed witnesses willing to stand still long enough to hear it. As he turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Richard felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not relief, not victory, but resolve, sharpened by clarity. They had lost this round, and they knew it, but the story wasn't finished yet. The arrest warrant was signed on a Friday, not announced, not leaked. Just processed quietly, the way serious things often were. Richard learned about it from Agent Collins in a brief call that contained no celebration and no reassurance. "She's in custody," Collins said. Evelyn Cross. Fraud. Unauthorized data access. Conspiracy to coerce. We're still building on the rest. And the people behind her? Richard asked. Watching, Collins replied. Waiting to see how far this goes. Richard understood that language well. That afternoon, Annie came home with a note from her teacher tucked carefully into her backpack. She handed it to him without comment. Watching his face as he read, Annie has been more open in class lately, more willing to speak. She shared something thoughtful today during reading circle. I wanted you to know. Richard folded the note slowly. Your teacher says you spoke up. Annie shrugged, suddenly shy. It was just a story. What kind of story? One where someone was scared, she said. But they told anyway. Richard smiled, small and genuine. That sounds like an important story. That evening, the first reporter showed up at the end of the drive. Not bold enough to approach, not discreet enough to disappear. Security handled it. The message was clear and polite. No comment, no access. Not now. Annie noticed the lights from the camera van flicker briefly through the trees. Are they looking at us again? She asked. Yes, Richard said. But they don't get to decide who we are. She seemed to accept that. Okay. Later, when Annie was asleep, Richard sat with Thomas in the study, reviewing the latest developments. They're going to pivot, Thomas said. Distance themselves from Evelyn, paint her as unstable, a lone actor, and sacrifice her, Richard replied. Yes, Thomas said. To protect the structure. Richard leaned back, fingers steepled. Then we make sure the structure is visible. Thomas studied him. You're thinking bigger. I'm thinking necessary, Richard replied. The next morning, Richard did something no one expected. He agreed to speak, not to a panel, not to a hostile interviewer. He chose a single journalist. Older, respected, known for patience rather than provocation. The interview took place in the study, the camera positioned carefully to avoid Annie's space. She was at a friend's house, unaware of the weight being carried in the room below. I won't discuss an ongoing investigation, Richard said calmly to the journalist, but I will say this. Silence is often mistaken for maturity. It isn't. It's fear. Taught early and reinforced often. The journalist didn't interrupt. When a child tells the truth quietly, Richard continued, and the system tries to drown it out with procedure and pressure, the problem isn't the child, it's us. The piece aired that evening, measured, thoughtful. No accusations, just reflection. It landed harder than any confrontation could have. By Monday, the conversation had shifted again. Not about Richard's leadership, not about instability, about systems that discouraged children from speaking, about adults who confused authority with infallibility. Annie noticed the change before Richard mentioned it. My friend's mom said you were on TV, she said over breakfast, but she didn't sound mad. What did she sound like? Richard asked. Like she was thinking, Annie replied. Richard nodded. That's good. But the backlash came anyway. Anonymous posts, thinly veiled warnings, messages that stopped just short of threats. The men behind Evelyn hadn't vanished. They had retreated, regrouped. One message made it through the filters. You embarrassed the wrong people. Richard deleted it without reply. That night, Annie woke from a bad dream. Richard was at her door before she called out. They were whispering, she said, voice demonstrably calm but eyes wide. In the dream, he sat beside her, grounding. What did you do? I told, she said. He brushed her hair back gently. Good. She looked at him seriously. They don't like it when people tell. No, Richard said. They don't. Are you scared? She asked. He considered the question carefully. I'm careful, he said. And I'm not alone. She seemed satisfied with that and settled back into the pillow. After she fell asleep, Richard remained seated, listening to the house. Not for danger, but for reassurance. The truth had moved beyond them now. It was no longer just Annie's story or his defense. It had become a mirror others were forced to look into. And mirrors, once raised, were hard to lower. Richard knew the cost was not over. He also knew something else, something steady and unshakable. They had underestimated the power of a child who refused to stay quiet, and they would not make that mistake again. The subpoenas arrived in waves, not dramatic envelopes delivered by hand, but digital notices routed through attorneys, compliance departments, and agencies that preferred precision over spectacle. Names Richard recognized appeared alongside names he didn't. Shell companies, consulting firms, quiet intermediaries whose only talent had been staying invisible. Until now, Thomas stood at the study table, sleeves rolled up, reviewing a diagram that looked more like a map than a legal brief. "They're connected," he said, tapping the page. Not tightly, but consistently. Financial pressure here, information laundering there. Evelyn wasn't the first, but she was the one who stepped into my house. Richard said. "Yes," Thomas replied. "That's what made this personal. And sloppy." That afternoon, Annie came home unusually animated. "My teacher asked us who we talk to when something feels bad," she said, dropping her backpack by the door. I said, "My dad." Richard smiled. "What did she say?" "She said that was good," Annie replied, then added, "Some kids didn't know who to say." The smile faded slightly. Later, as Annie worked on a craft project at the table, Richard took a call in the adjacent room. "Mr. Hale," Agent Collins said, "we're expanding the scope. What started as coercion is looking like a pattern across multiple households." "Children?" Richard asked. "Yes," Collins said. "Not always adopted, not always wealthy, but always isolated in some way, always told not to speak." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "How many?" "Enough," Collins said. "And more than we thought." When Richard returned to the table, Annie looked up at him, reading his face the way she always did now. "Is it a bad call?" she asked. "It's an important one," he said. She nodded and went back to cutting paper carefully along a dotted line. That evening, Richard attended a closed-door meeting with 2 senators, one federal judge, and a child advocacy liaison. No press, no statements, just listening and facts. One of the senators leaned back in his chair. "You understand this opens doors you can't close." "Yes," Richard replied. "And scrutiny you won't control," the judge added. Richard met her gaze. "Children don't control scrutiny either. That hasn't stopped it from finding them." Silence followed. The liaison spoke next. "What you're describing isn't rare. What's rare is someone with your resources choosing exposure over settlement." Richard thought of Annie, whispering into a phone in the dark. "Settlement would have been easier," he said, "but it would have taught the wrong lesson." When he returned home late, Annie was already asleep. Richard stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall, the steady rhythm grounding him after hours of careful restraint. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. "You changed things," he murmured softly. "You don't even know how much." The next day, the story broke wider, not sensationally, respectably. A long-form piece appeared in a national paper, outlining a quiet network that leveraged access to households through trusted adults, using fear and silence as tools. No names of children, no images, just patterns, just truth. Richard was mentioned only once. As a parent who refused to settle quietly, the backlash was immediate and fractured. Some praised the exposure, others accused him of grandstanding. A few hinted darkly that he had ulterior motives. But the conversation no longer belonged to those who wanted it buried. Annie noticed the tension anyway. "People are talking about you again," she said at breakfast. "Yes," Richard said. "They will for a while." "Are they mad?" she asked. "Some are," he said honestly. "Some are relieved." She thought about that. "Relieved is better." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." That afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to Annie. Richard opened it first, carefully. It was handwritten, shaky but sincere. "I heard your story without knowing your name. I wish I had told someone when I was little. Thank you for helping people listen." Richard folded the letter and handed it to Annie. She read it slowly, lips moving silently. "I didn't know them," she said. "No," Richard replied. "But you helped them anyway." She held the letter for a long moment, then placed it carefully in her drawer. That night, Thomas called from the guest room. "They're closing in," he said. "Indictments will come. Not tomorrow, but soon." "And retaliation?" Richard asked. "Likely quieter now," Thomas said. "They don't like light." Richard ended the call and stood by the window once more. The grounds were calm, the cameras steady, no figures near the gate. For the first time in weeks, the quiet felt earned. Upstairs, Annie slept without dreams that made her call out. Richard turned off the lights and headed up the stairs. The hardest part was behind them, not because the danger was gone, but because the truth had taken root. And once rooted, it was harder to erase than anyone had anticipated. The first indictment was unsealed on a Monday morning. Not Evelyn's. Hers had already become a footnote, one name among many. This one belonged to a consulting firm no one outside certain circles had ever heard of. The charge was narrow on paper, conspiracy to commit coercion across state lines, but the language inside was precise, deliberate, impossible to misread. It named patterns, it named methods, and it named intent. Richard read the document alone in the study, the early light slanting across the desk. He didn't feel satisfaction, only confirmation. The truth, once dragged into the open, had begun to choose its own path. By the time Annie came downstairs, the house was already awake with quiet movement. Phones vibrated. Doors opened and closed softly, the rhythm of a place adjusting to a new normal. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Is today busy?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said. "But not for you." She smiled faintly. "Good." He drove her to school himself, as he did most days now. The street outside the building was crowded with parents, children, backpacks, ordinary life continuing without pause. Annie unbuckled and hesitated before opening the door. "Dad?" she said. "Yes? Do you think the other kids, the ones who were quiet, are okay now?" Richard considered the question. "I think some of them are starting to be," he said, "because people are paying attention." She nodded, satisfied, and climbed out of the car. That afternoon, Richard received a call he had been expecting, but not yet ready for. "Mr. Hale," Agent Collins said, "we need to discuss a protective detail for Annie." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Why now?" "The network is contracting," Collins replied. "That's when unpredictable things happen." Richard thought of the men at the gate. The messages that had stopped just short of threats. The way pressure shifted when it failed. "Discreet," Richard said. "She doesn't need to feel watched." "Understood." That evening, Annie was quieter than usual. She ate her dinner without comment, pushing peas around her plate before finally finishing them. "You're thinking," Richard said. She nodded. "My friend asked why people were on the news because of me." Richard leaned back slightly. "What did you say?" "I said I just told my dad," she replied. "I didn't know it would be so loud." Richard reached across the table and took her hand. "Sometimes telling the truth makes noise," he said. "That doesn't mean you did something wrong." She looked down at their hands. "I don't like being important." "You don't have to be," he said. "You just have to be honest." That seemed to settle something in her. Later that night, Richard met Thomas in the study. "They're closing ranks," Thomas said. "Some will flip, some will disappear, but a few will lash out." "And Evelyn?" Richard asked. "Cooperating," Thomas replied. "Selective, but useful." Richard nodded. "She always was." As if summoned by the thought, a message arrived on Richard's phone, from Evelyn's attorney. "Miss Cross would like to speak with you." Privately, Richard stared at the screen for a long moment. "No," he said aloud. Thomas watched him carefully. "You're sure?" "Yes," Richard replied. "She doesn't get access anymore. To me or to my child." Thomas nodded. "That's the right call." Upstairs, Annie had finished her homework and was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Richard sat beside her, the way he did most nights now. "Dad," she said quietly. "Yes? Do you think being quiet ever helps?" Richard thought carefully. "Being quiet can help you listen," he said, "but it shouldn't stop you from being safe." She turned onto her side. "I like listening," she said, "but I don't want to be invisible." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "You aren't," he said. "And you never were." She smiled faintly and closed her eyes. After she fell asleep, Richard remained seated, listening to the house. The quiet was no longer tense. It felt watchful in a different way, protective rather than threatened. Downstairs, His phone buzzed again. Another indictment, another name. The structure was coming apart, piece by piece. Richard stood by the window one last time before turning in for the night. He thought of how easily this could have gone another way, how close he had come to dismissing a whisper because it didn't arrive loudly enough. He understood now what Annie had taught him without realizing it. Courage didn't announce itself. It waited for someone to listen. And because he had listened, others were beginning to do the same. The attempted breach happened on a Sunday afternoon. Not dramatic, not violent, almost polite. Richard was in the kitchen helping Annie bake cookies, flour dusting the counter, the smell of butter and sugar warming the house. Annie stood on a stool, carefully cracking an egg the way she had practiced, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "I didn't get shell in it," she said proudly. "You're improving," Richard replied. "That takes patience." The security alert came through his watch as a single, quiet vibration. He didn't move. He didn't look at it right away. He finished helping Annie stir, then guided her to the sink to wash her hands. "Can you put the tray on the counter?" he asked. "I need to check something." She nodded, focused on her task. In the adjacent room, Richard glanced at the screen. Unauthorized access attempt. External network. Blocked. Thomas appeared in the doorway almost immediately, his expression tight but controlled. "Not sophisticated," Thomas said. "More symbolic." "Message received," Richard replied. "They wanted to see if the noise rattled you," Thomas continued. It didn't. Richard looked back toward the kitchen, where Annie was humming softly to herself. "It won't," he said. "Not like this." That evening, after Annie went to bed, the call came. Agent Collins's voice was steady. "We traced the attempt. It was routed through a shell server tied to a remaining associate." He panicked. "And?" Richard asked. "He's in custody," Collins said. "Talking." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Good." When the call ended, Richard didn't feel relief. He felt inevitability. The collapse had reached the stage where even the careful ones made mistakes. Monday brought confirmation. Another indictment. Broader this time. Names that had never appeared on paper before. Roles that were implied, not stated. The kind of language that signaled a case built to endure. Annie noticed the shift in the house immediately. "You're quieter," she said at breakfast. "I'm thinking," Richard replied. She tilted her head. "About hard things?" "Yes," he said honestly. "But they're getting easier." She seemed to like that answer. At school pickup, Annie ran toward him instead of walking, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She skidded to a stop and held up a folded piece of paper. "We had to write about someone who makes us feel safe," she said. Richard took the paper carefully. It wasn't long. The spelling wasn't perfect, but the meaning was unmistakable. "My dad listens, even when I whisper." Richard folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket, unable to trust his voice right away. That night, Thomas briefed him again. "They're offering deals," Thomas said. "Reduced sentences in exchange for testimony." "And the core?" Richard asked. "Exposed," Thomas replied. "Not all of them charged yet, but named. Publicly." Richard nodded. "That's enough." "Is it?" Thomas asked quietly. Richard thought of the letter Annie had received, of the interview room, of the network that had relied on silence, like gravity. "It has to be," Richard said. "Otherwise we never stop." Later, as Richard tucked Annie into bed, she asked a question that surprised him. "Dad, when this is over, will people stop talking?" Richard sat beside her. "Some will," he said. "Some won't." She frowned. "I don't want to be a story." "You aren't," he said gently. "You're a person. Stories are what adults use to understand what they should have listened to sooner." She considered that, then nodded. "Okay." After she fell asleep, Richard stood in the hallway longer than usual, listening to the quiet. It no longer felt like something that could be broken easily. Downstairs, his phone buzzed with a final message from Thomas for the night. "They're done pushing. Now they're bracing." Richard set the phone down and turned off the light. The danger wasn't gone. It had transformed. What had once been whispered in the dark was now being documented, testified to, archived. The kind of truth that didn't shout, but stayed, and in the stillness of the house, Richard understood the shape of the ending that was coming. Not a victory parade, not revenge, just a return to something honest. Upstairs, Annie slept without dreams that needed waking. And for the first time since that midnight call, Richard allowed himself to believe that quiet could mean peace, because it had been earned, not enforced. The trial did not begin with drama. No crowded steps, no shouted questions. Just a courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, where people took their seats as if attending a meeting they had postponed for too long. Richard arrived early, as he always did now. He did not bring Annie. That decision had been deliberate and final. Some battles were fought so children wouldn't have to sit in rooms like this. He took his place behind counsel, posture straight, expression unreadable. Across the room, Evelyn sat smaller than he remembered her. Hair pulled back too tightly, hands folded as if trying to hold herself together through sheer force of habit. She did not look at him. When proceedings began, the language was dry, procedural. Charges read into the record. Names that once carried influence now reduced to syllables, spoken without respect. But beneath the surface, the weight was unmistakable. Witnesses followed. Experts. Analysts. Former associates who had chosen cooperation over loyalty that would not protect them. Then came testimony no one had anticipated being so devastating in its restraint. A former caseworker, a school administrator, a psychologist who spoke about silence as a learned behavior, about how children adapted to environments where adults punished honesty not with violence, but with withdrawal. No child starts silent, she said calmly. Silence is taught. Richard felt that sentence settle somewhere deep. During a recess, Thomas leaned toward him. "They're done," he murmured. "They just don't know it yet." Richard didn't respond. He watched the empty witness chair, thinking of Annie's small voice on the phone, thinking of how close he had come to missing it. When court adjourned for the day, the press waited outside. Richard did not stop. At home, Annie was working on a drawing at the kitchen table when he walked in. She looked up immediately. "You're back early." "I am," he said. She studied his face. "Is it finished?" "Not yet," Richard replied. "But it's going the right way." She nodded, satisfied with that. That evening, they ate together without the television on. Annie talked about a class project, about a plant she was responsible for watering. Ordinary things, necessary things. After dinner, she asked a question she had clearly been holding. "Did you ever feel bad for her?" Annie asked. Richard paused. "For Evelyn? Yes." He considered the truth carefully. "I feel sad that she made choices that hurt people," he said. "But feeling sad doesn't mean excusing them." Annie thought about that. "I feel sad sometimes," she said, "but I don't want to hurt people." "That's the difference," Richard replied gently. Later that night, Richard received confirmation. The jury would not need long. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern too clear. Silence had protected the wrong people for too long. When the verdict came 2 days later, it arrived without surprise. Guilty, on multiple counts. Sentencing would follow. But the outcome was already sealed in a way no appeal could undo. Richard stood as the judge spoke about responsibility, about breach of trust, about harm that could not be quantified but would be acknowledged. Evelyn looked up once then, eyes hollow. Richard did not look back. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters called his name. He stopped this time. "Is this justice?" one asked. Richard considered the question, then answered slowly. "Justice isn't loud," he said. "It's what happens when people finally listen." That quote would be replayed later, stripped of context, debated. But that night, none of that mattered. At home, Annie waited up for him, sitting on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said. She studied his face, then smiled softly. "Good." He sat beside her. "You okay?" She nodded. "I was thinking. I don't feel scared anymore." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I'm glad." She leaned against his side, quiet, comfortable. Outside, the city moved on. News cycles shifted, new stories demanded attention, but inside that house, something settled permanently. Not victory, not relief, something steadier. The knowledge that silence had been broken and that once broken, it did not easily return. The house learned a new rhythm, not overnight, and not without echoes of what had been. But mornings no longer carried the tension of waiting for bad news, and nights no longer ended with Richard standing still in the dark, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Spring settled fully over Chicago. Annie noticed it first. "The trees look different," she said one morning, pressing her face briefly to the window. "They don't look tired anymore." Richard smiled at the description. "Neither do you." She grinned, then grew serious. "Dad?" "Yes? When people stop talking about the trial, will it really be over?" Richard took a moment before answering. "It will be over in the way storms are over," he said. "The ground remembers, but the sky clears." She seemed to like that. She carried it with her, the way children carry things that make sense to them, even if they can't explain why. Life continued in deliberate steps. Annie returned fully to school without special arrangements. The protective detail faded into the background, present but unobtrusive. Reporters moved on to louder scandals, quicker outrage. What remained were letters, some handwritten, some typed, some sent through advocacy groups or intermediaries who didn't want names attached. They came from adults who had once been children who learned early that silence was safer than honesty. Richard read them late at night, never in front of Annie. He didn't want her to carry the weight of what she had helped unlock. But one afternoon, she found a single envelope left open on the desk. She didn't read the letter. She didn't need to. "Did someone else tell?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said. "Are they okay?" "They're getting there," he replied. She nodded. "That's good." On a quiet Sunday, Richard took Annie to the park. Not a private one, not secluded. Just a public park with worn benches, squeaking swings, and parents watching from a distance with coffee cups in hand. Annie ran ahead, shoes pounding against the path, laughter free and unguarded. Richard sat on a bench and watched her climb, slide, stumble, recover. Ordinary, extraordinary in its simplicity. A woman sitting nearby glanced at him, then at Annie. "You're her dad," she said, not asking. "Yes," Richard replied. "My sister watched the trial," the woman continued. She said, "It mattered." Richard inclined his head politely. "I'm glad." The woman hesitated, then added, "Your daughter is brave." Richard looked back at Annie, now hanging upside down from the monkey bars, hair falling in her face, laughing at nothing in particular. "She's honest," he said. "That's harder." That night, Annie asked for a story before bed. "Not a scary one," she said quickly. "A real one." Richard sat beside her, considering. "Once," he began, "there was a house where people stopped listening because listening felt risky. And because no one listened, bad things learned how to hide." Annie watched him closely. "One night," he continued, "a small voice spoke anyway. Not loud, not perfectly, just honest." "And then?" Annie asked. "And then," Richard said, "the house remembered what it was for." She smiled, satisfied. "That's a good story." "It's a true one," he replied. Weeks passed, then months. Sentencing came and went, reported briefly, then archived. Names once powerful were now cautionary footnotes. Policies shifted quietly. Training programs changed language. New procedures were written with care instead of convenience. No one called it Annie's legacy. Richard wouldn't have allowed that. But change moved in directions it hadn't before. One evening, as summer approached, Annie sat at the kitchen table drawing. "What are you making?" Richard asked. "A map," she said. "Of what?" "Of places that feel safe," Annie replied. "So I remember." Richard watched as she colored carefully, labeling corners only she understood. "Can I add this house?" she asked. "Yes," he said, voice steady. "Always." Later that night, Richard stood by the window one last time, the habit lingering even though the need had passed. The grounds were quiet, not the tense quiet of before, the earned kind. He thought of the man he had been before the phone rang in the dark, the man who believed protection meant distance, and that silence was a kind of order. He understood now how wrong that had been. Protection was presence, order was listening. Upstairs, Annie slept deeply, one arm flung across the pillow. Breathing even, Richard turned off the light and headed upstairs. The story did not end with punishment or applause. It ended with something rarer. A child who no longer whispered because she didn't have to. A father who would never again mistake quiet for safety. and a house that had learned, finally, what it meant to listen. This story reminds us that danger does not always arrive loudly, and courage does not always speak in a strong voice. Sometimes the most powerful act is a quiet truth, told by someone who has been taught to stay silent. It teaches that adults have a responsibility to listen, especially to children, because silence often protects the wrong people. Real protection is not control or distance, but presence, trust, and the willingness to believe. In the end, justice is not about revenge or spectacle. It is about creating a world where the vulnerable are heard, where fear loses its grip, and where honesty, even when whispered, is enough to change everything. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.